The silence in William Carter's office was suffocating. The polished oak desk, the framed accolades on the walls, and the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock all added to the tension. Jason sat across from his father, his jaw tight, refusing to meet William's steely gaze. "I have had enough of your recklessness, Jason," William finally said, his voice firm and measured. "The partying, the drinking, the money wasted on nonsense, it stops today." Jason shifted in his seat, pretending to be indifferent, but something about his father's tone sent a cold shiver down his spine. This was not just another lecture. There was something final about this moment. "I built this company from nothing," William continued, leaning forward. His sharp blue eyes locked onto Jason's. "And I will not let you destroy everything I have worked for. No more trust fund, no more endless credit cards, and no more getting away with everything." Jason scoffed, forcing a smirk. "What? Are you going to ground me, Dad? I am not a kid anymore." William's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no warmth in it. "No, Jason. I am not going to ground you. I am going to fix you." Jason frowned, his frustration growing. "Fix me? What does that even mean?" "You are getting married," William said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jason blinked, momentarily stunned. Then he let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You have lost your mind, old man. I am not marrying anyone." William sat back, completely unmoved. "You do not have a choice." Jason's fists clenched. His father had always been controlling, but this was on another level. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he snapped, standing abruptly. "You cannot just—" "I can," William interrupted, his voice calm and unshaken. "And I will." Jason's chest rose and fell with anger. "Who is she?" "Some society girl you picked out at a country club." William's expression remained unreadable. "Her name is Sarah. She is a farmer." Jason stared at him, incredulous. "A farmer?" His voice cracked slightly. "This is a joke, right? You want me to marry some girl from the middle of nowhere?" "Yes," William confirmed. "She lives in Montana. She is hardworking, responsible, and lives a life that you desperately need to experience." Jason felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. His father had punished him before, cutting off credit cards, forcing him to take minor jobs in the company. But this was something else entirely. "You are insane," Jason said, shaking his head. "You actually think you can control my life like this?" William stood, towering over his son. "This is your last chance, Jason. You are going to marry Sarah and live on that farm. You are going to learn what it means to work for something." Jason narrowed his eyes. "And if I refuse?" William's gaze hardened. "Then you are on your own. No money, no help, nothing. You will not last a month without me." Silence filled the room. Jason's mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was none. He could walk away, reject the whole thing, but that would mean giving up everything. Or he could play along, marry this complete stranger, and live in the middle of nowhere like some nobody. It was humiliating. It was ridiculous. And yet, looking at his father's expression, he knew there was no way out. Jason sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of the decision crush him. He did not have a choice. Not really. William exhaled, satisfied. "You leave in 2 days. Get your affairs in order." Jason did not answer. He could not. His life, as he knew it, was over. 2 days passed in a blur of disbelief. Jason found himself standing on the side of a dusty road, looking out at a scene he had only seen in movies. The smell of fresh earth and grass filled his nostrils, too fresh, too clean. The air felt foreign compared to the city smog he was used to. His polished leather shoes sank slightly into the dirt as he eyed the farmhouse in the distance. This was where his father had sent him. With a heavy sigh, Jason picked up his suitcase and started down the gravel road. Each step felt like another nail in the coffin of his old life. The farmhouse was small, its white paint peeling, its porch creaking in the wind. It was not much, but it had a certain simple charm, though Jason would never admit it. As he reached the porch, the front door swung open, and there she was. Sarah. Jason had no idea what to expect, but when he saw her, he felt his breath hitch. She was nothing like he had imagined. Standing on the porch, she wore faded jeans, scuffed-up boots, and a simple plaid shirt. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her face held a serious expression, unsmiling, unreadable. Yet there was a quiet strength about her, as if the land itself had forged her resilience. She eyed him up and down, taking in his expensive, completely out-of-place suit with something bordering on skepticism. "So, you are Jason Carter?" she asked, her tone flat, almost doubtful, as if she found the whole situation too ridiculous to be real. Jason swallowed, his usual arrogance faltering under her unwavering stare. "Yeah, that is me," he said, trying to sound casual. He let his suitcase drop onto the porch with a loud thud. Sarah did not answer immediately. Instead, she crossed her arms, studying him from head to toe. He felt exposed under her gaze, like she could see every ounce of privilege and entitlement he carried. "I take it your father did not tell you much about me," she finally said, her voice steady but firm. "So, let me make something clear. I did not ask for this. And I sure as hell did not want it." Jason blinked. He had assumed she was in on the whole arrangement, some small-town girl eager to marry into money. But her tone left no doubt. She had no interest in him or anything he thought he had to offer. "That makes two of us," Jason shot back, unable to hide the bitterness in his voice. "I did not exactly sign up for this either." Sarah gave a small nod, but there was no sympathy in her expression. She was not about to make him feel better about the situation. "Well," she said, glancing at his suitcase, "you are here now. We might as well get on with it." With that, she turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open behind her. Jason hesitated for a moment before picking up his bag and following her inside. The house was small but clean, with well-worn furniture and personal touches that made it feel lived in. It was nothing like the cold, sterile luxury of his New York penthouse, but there was a warmth to it that he could not quite ignore. "Your room is down the hall," Sarah called over her shoulder. "Get settled in, then I will show you around." "Right," Jason muttered, dragging his suitcase across the wooden floor. The room was simple, a small bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking endless fields. It was a far cry from the life he knew, but he was not planning to stay long. In his mind, this was just a temporary inconvenience until he figured out a way back to his real life. After dropping his suitcase on the bed, he returned to the kitchen, where Sarah stood by the sink, staring out the window. She did not acknowledge him when he entered, but the silence between them was thick. "So, what is the plan?" Jason asked, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Are we supposed to what? Pretend to be married? Play house on your little farm?" Sarah turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "We do not have to pretend anything, Jason. This is real, whether we like it or not." Her words stung more than he expected. There was something about the way she said it, so matter-of-fact, like she had already accepted the situation while he was still trying to fight it. "I run this farm," she continued. "It is my livelihood. My father left it to me, and I am not about to let it fall apart just because you do not want to be here. So, you are going to pull your weight." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Pull my weight? I do not know the first thing about farming." Sarah's gaze narrowed slightly. "Then you will learn." Before he could argue, she turned back to the window, effectively ending the conversation. Jason stood there, frustration bubbling inside him. He was stuck in a life he did not want, with a woman who had no intention of making things easy for him. But there was no way out. The first morning on the farm came far too early. Jason was used to sleeping in, waking whenever he felt like it, usually recovering from a night of drinking. But here, the rooster crowed at dawn, a cruel reminder that his old life was gone. The sun was barely up when Sarah knocked on his door. "Get up," she called, her voice sharp. We have work to do, Jason groaned, rolling over in the too small bed, the mattress creaking beneath him. Every instinct told him to pull the covers over his head and pretend he was still in his penthouse. But he knew better than to push back, at least not yet. Dragging himself out of bed, he pulled on the same clothes from the day before. They already felt out of place here, too clean, too refined for the rough world he had been thrown into. When he finally made his way outside, Sarah was already at work, sleeves rolled up as she carried feed to the animals. "Grab that shovel," she said without looking up. "You are mucking out the stalls today." Jason stared at her in disbelief. "Mucking out the what?" She finally turned to him, her expression unimpressed. "The stalls, Jason. You know, where the animals live. They need to be cleaned out every day." He glanced at the barn, where horses, cows, and a few pigs stood watching him as if they, too, knew he did not belong there. His stomach turned. "You have got to be kidding me," he muttered. But Sarah was not kidding. She did not even acknowledge his complaint, simply handed him the shovel and walked off to tend to other tasks. Jason stood there, gripping the shovel awkwardly. He had no idea what he was doing, and it showed. With a heavy sigh, he stepped into the first stall, immediately gagging at the smell. The reality of farm life hit him like a freight train. It was dirty, smelly, and completely miserable. There was nothing glamorous about it. But as much as he hated it, he knew one thing: complaining would not get him out of this. Not yet, anyway. With a deep breath, he jabbed the shovel into the straw, grimacing as he got to work. This was not the kind of work someone like him was supposed to be doing. He was supposed to be sitting in boardrooms, making business deals, playing golf with investors, not shoveling manure in a barn. Not this. Never this. As the hours dragged on, Jason found himself sweating and aching in ways he never had before. His back protested every time he bent down, and his arms felt like dead weight. Every part of him wanted to quit, to throw the shovel down and walk away. But there was nowhere to go. Montana stretched out endlessly around him, isolating him from everything he once knew. The realization made his chest tighten. He felt trapped. At midday, Sarah returned, her face still unreadable, though slightly less severe than before. "How is it going?" Jason wiped the sweat from his forehead, glaring at the half-finished task with a mix of frustration and exhaustion. "How do you think it is going?" he snapped, too tired to filter his words. Sarah did not respond immediately. She simply stepped closer, scanning his work. "Not bad," she said evenly. "But you are not done." Jason blinked at her, incredulous. "Not done? I have been at this for hours." "Farm work does not care how long you have been at it," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "It cares about getting done." She handed him a bottle of water before turning back to her own work. He watched her walk away, resentment rising in his chest. He was not built for this. He was not meant to break his back just to keep a farm running. This was not his life. And yet, somehow, it was now. He had no choice. By the time the sun began to set, Jason's entire body ached in ways he had never known. His clothes were filthy, and his hands were raw and blistered from gripping the shovel all day. When he finally finished the last stall, he slumped against the side of the barn, too exhausted to move. Sarah appeared again, this time carrying 2 plates of food, simple sandwiches and a couple of apples. She handed one to him wordlessly before sitting down beside him, gazing out over the open fields. "You will get used to it," she said quietly. Jason took a bite of his sandwich, too drained to argue. "I do not know if I will." Sarah glanced at him, her expression as unreadable as ever. "You will. People can adapt to more than they think." They sat in silence after that, the weight of the day settling over them. The farm was quiet now, the animals settled in, the golden light of dusk stretching over the land. For the first time since arriving, Jason felt a strange sense of calm. It was not the life he wanted, but there was something about the simplicity of it all, something that, for a fleeting moment, made him feel less lost. But the feeling did not last long. As the evening breeze swept through the fields, Jason was reminded of the life he had left behind, the life that was still waiting for him, if he could ever find a way back. Montana might have been peaceful, but it was not home. Not yet. Days turned into weeks, and Jason's life on the farm settled into a relentless rhythm. He woke before dawn, spent the day performing exhausting labor, and went to bed aching, only to do it all over again the next morning. No matter how much he resisted, the farm had a way of pulling him into its rhythm. Despite his growing familiarity with the work, the tension between him and Sarah remained. They barely spoke outside of what was necessary. Their conversations were short, clipped, purely transactional. Jason was not used to being ignored, especially by a woman. Back in New York, he was always the center of attention. Here, he was just another pair of hands. One evening, after a long, grueling day, Jason found himself pacing the kitchen, restless. The silence of the house gnawed at him. Sarah was still outside, tending to the animals for the night. Through the window, he could see her moving with the same quiet determination she always had. There was something about her unwavering self-sufficiency that unsettled him. She did not need him. She barely acknowledged him. It was almost insulting. Grabbing a glass of water, Jason leaned against the counter, staring out at the darkening sky. His frustration was mounting with nowhere to go. This was supposed to be temporary, a punishment, sure, but one he could endure until his father came to his senses. Yet no call came. No check-in. It was as if his father had abandoned him completely. The door creaked open, and Sarah stepped inside, wiping her hands on a rag. She glanced at him but said nothing, moving toward the sink to wash up. The silence between them was thick. Jason exhaled sharply. "Do you enjoy this?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Sarah did not turn around. "Enjoy what?" "This," he gestured vaguely around the kitchen. "Having me here. Dealing with this ridiculous situation. Do you enjoy watching me struggle out there, looking like an idiot every day?" Sarah finally turned, her expression unreadable. "I did not ask for this any more than you did." "That is not an answer," Jason shot back, his voice rising. "You have been treating me like an outsider since the day I got here. I get it, I am not a farmer. But I am trying. Does that mean anything to you?" Sarah took a slow breath, setting the rag down on the counter. "Trying? You have been here what, a month? You still act like this is all temporary, like you are going to pack up and leave any day now. I have lived my whole life on this farm. It is not some punishment to me, Jason. It is my life." Jason blinked, thrown by the weight of her words. He had not thought about it that way. To him, this was just a sentence to serve. To her, it was home. "I never asked to be here," Jason muttered, running a hand through his hair. "None of this makes sense." Sarah crossed her arms. "No, it does not. But that does not change the fact that you are here. And if you are going to stay, then stop acting like the world owes you something. No one is going to hold your hand out here." Jason's frustration flared. "I do not need anyone to hold my hand. But I am also not used to being treated like I do not exist." Sarah's expression softened, just slightly. "I do not treat you like you do not exist, Jason. I treat you like a grown man who has a lot to learn. You want me to pat you on the back for every little thing you do? That is not how this works." The words stung more than Jason wanted to admit. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who praised him for even the smallest accomplishments. Here, there were no easy wins. And Sarah certainly was not the kind of person to hand out praise just for showing up. "I am trying," Jason said again, this time more quietly. "I really am." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I know. But trying is not enough. You have to commit. You have to actually want to be here. Not just go through the motions until you can leave." Jason looked away, unsure of how to respond. Did he want to be here? Not really. But he did not want to go back to New York either, not yet at least. The thought of returning to his old life, where everything was handed to him, did not sit right anymore. Something had shifted, even if he was not ready to admit it to himself. "I guess we will see," he mumbled more to himself than to her. Sarah did not press further. Instead, she turned back to the sink, her focus shifting back to the tasks at hand. The conversation was over, but the tension lingered, a quiet reminder of the gap between them that still needed to be bridged. Jason stood in the kitchen for a while longer, feeling the weight of the silence settle around him again. He was not used to being this out of control, this powerless. But maybe that was the point. Maybe that was what his father wanted all along. As he made his way back to his small bedroom, frustration clung to him. But beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, something that felt almost like resolve. The days rolled on, each one blending into the next. But something had started to shift in Jason's routine. He still hated the early mornings, the grueling work, and the relentless summer sun beating down on him. But somewhere in the monotony of farm life, he began to notice things, little things. The quiet, for one. The stillness of the mornings before the rest of the world seemed to wake up. Back in New York, his mornings had been filled with noise, traffic, ringing phones, people rushing. Here, the only sounds were the rustling of trees, the distant clucking of chickens, and the hum of the wind sweeping across the open fields. At first, the silence was unsettling, almost too loud. But now, he found it almost peaceful. Jason still could not shake the feeling of being out of place. But there were moments when, standing in the field with the sun low on the horizon, he felt like he was a part of something bigger than himself. It was a strange sensation, one he did not quite know how to process. One evening, after a long day of hauling hay, he sat on the porch steps, staring out over the fields. Sarah was out with the chickens, her figure silhouetted against the fading light. She moved with a quiet efficiency, always working, always focused. Watching her, Jason could not help but feel a grudging respect. She ran the farm like it was second nature, with a determination he had never seen before. As Sarah walked back toward the house, she caught his gaze but did not look away. Instead, she climbed the steps and sat beside him, her hands resting on her knees. For a few minutes they sat in silence, the only sound the distant buzz of insects and the occasional chirp of a bird settling in for the night. "You are getting better," Sarah said finally, breaking the quiet. Her voice was not overly warm, but there was a note of acknowledgement there. Jason raised an eyebrow, surprised by the unexpected comment. "At what?" "Shoveling manure?" Sarah's lips twitched, almost like she was fighting back a smile. "At the work. You are not half as useless as you were when you first got here." Jason snorted. "Well, thanks, I guess. That is the nicest thing you have said to me in a month." Sarah did not respond immediately, just leaned back against the porch railing and looked out over the farm. "This is not easy, Jason," she said after a moment. "Running a place like this takes everything you have. Some people break under it. I have seen it happen." Jason looked over at her, watching as she spoke. There was a weariness in her voice, but not weakness. It was the kind of weariness that came from carrying the weight of responsibility for too long without anyone to share it with. He realized then just how much Sarah had been doing, day in and day out, without complaint, without help. "I do not know how you do it," Jason admitted, his voice low. "I can barely keep up with the work, and you make it look easy." Sarah shook her head. "It is not easy. But it is necessary. If I do not do it, the farm does not survive. My father left this place to me, and I will be damned if I let it fall apart." There was something in her words that resonated with Jason. The way she spoke about the farm was not just practical. It was personal. The farm was not just a place to her. It was her legacy, her connection to her family, her identity. "I never had that," Jason said, almost without thinking. "That sense of purpose. I always thought I was supposed to follow in my father's footsteps, but I never really cared about any of it. It was just expected." Sarah glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "Then maybe this is your chance to find something that matters to you." Jason did not respond right away. He was not sure what mattered to him. His life in New York had been all about appearances, money, status, power. None of it had ever felt real. But here, on the farm, for all its hardship and isolation, there was something undeniably real about it. The work was tangible. The results immediate. It was not glamorous, but it was honest. "I do not know," Jason said finally. "Maybe I am still figuring that out." Sarah nodded, not pressing the issue. Instead, she stood up, brushing the dirt off her jeans. "Well, I guess we will see. For now, there is still work to do tomorrow." Jason watched as she headed back inside, leaving him alone on the porch. The sky was fading into a deep blue, the stars just beginning to poke through. He stayed there for a while, thinking about what she had said, finding something that mattered. It was a simple idea, but it gnawed at him. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe this was his chance to find something real, something meaningful. But the thought scared him. He had spent so much of his life hiding behind wealth and privilege that he was not sure if he knew how to be anyone else. As the night deepened, Jason finally stood up and walked inside, the quiet of the farm settling around him like a blanket. For the first time in weeks, he did not feel like he was drowning. Maybe, just maybe, he could start to swim. The next few days brought a strange sense of rhythm to Jason's life on the farm. He was still far from mastering the work, but something had changed. Instead of dragging his feet, he began to approach each day with a bit more determination. His hands were still blistered, and his muscles ached in places he did not even know existed. But it did not feel as overwhelming as it had in the beginning. One morning, as the sun began to rise, Jason found himself outside early, waiting for Sarah to give him his tasks for the day. He was not sure when it had happened, but at some point, he had stopped dreading the mornings. There was something about the quiet before the day truly began that was almost calming. Standing there, with the cool breeze on his face and the distant sounds of the animals waking up, he felt a strange sense of peace. Sarah came out of the house shortly after, her usual no-nonsense expression in place. She gave him a quick glance, noting his early appearance, but said nothing. Instead, she walked toward the barn, and Jason followed without a word. "I am going to show you how to tend to the horses today," Sarah said as they reached the stable. "It is not just about feeding them or cleaning up after them. You need to learn how to care for them properly." Jason nodded, though he was not entirely sure what that entailed. He had seen horses before, at country clubs or racetracks, but he had never actually been close to one, let alone cared for one. Still, he followed Sarah into the barn, trying to look like he knew what he was doing. Sarah led him to a tall bay horse, its deep brown coat gleaming in the morning light. "This is Duke," she said, patting the horse's neck gently. "He is one of the older ones, but he is strong and reliable." Jason stood awkwardly by, watching as Sarah worked with the horse, her movements confident and sure. She showed him how to brush the horse's coat, explaining the importance of checking for any cuts or sores. Then, she handed him the brush. "Your turn," she said simply. Jason hesitated for a moment, but then took the brush and stepped closer to Duke. The horse shifted slightly, its large eyes watching him with mild curiosity. Jason could feel the size and power of the animal, and for a brief moment, he wondered if it would sense his inexperience and bolt. But Duke stood still, seemingly patient, as Jason began to brush his coat. It was not long before Jason found a rhythm, his movements becoming smoother and more confident. Sarah watched him for a while before moving on to the next horse, letting him work in peace. As he brushed Duke's coat, Jason felt a strange connection forming, one he had not expected. The work was calming, methodical, and for once, he did not feel completely out of his depth. When he finished with Duke, Sarah came back over, inspecting his work with a critical eye. "Not bad," she said, her voice devoid of any patronizing tone. "You have got the hang of it." Jason could not help but feel a small sense of pride at her words. It was not much, but it was the first time she had acknowledged his progress without sarcasm. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to earn her respect. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Sarah continued to show him the ins and outs of farm work, how to mend a fence, how to properly feed and water the livestock, and even how to drive the old tractor that had been sitting near the barn for as long as Jason could remember. He was not great at any of it, but he was getting better, slowly but surely. By the time the sun began to set, Jason was exhausted, his muscles sore from the day's work. But for once, he did not feel defeated. Instead, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. It was enough to keep him going. As they wrapped up for the day, Sarah handed him a bucket of water, gesturing toward the barn. "You are responsible for the horses now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Make sure they are taken care of every morning and every night." Jason blinked, surprised. "You are giving me responsibility? Already?" Sarah shrugged. "You have proven you can handle it. If you mess it up, we will know soon enough." It was not exactly a glowing endorsement, but Jason could not help but feel a surge of satisfaction. She was trusting him with something important, something that mattered to the farm. It was not just about keeping up appearances or going through the motions anymore. He had a real role to play. That night, as he lay in bed, Jason found himself staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in his mind. It had been hard, harder than anything he had done in New York, but it had also felt right in a way. The work was not glamorous or exciting, but it was real, tangible. And for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he was actually contributing to something. He was not sure when the shift had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had stopped thinking about how to escape the farm. Instead, he was starting to wonder if there was something more here. Something worth staying for. It was a quiet thought, one he was not ready to fully acknowledge yet, but as he drifted off to sleep, the idea lingered, settling in the back of his mind like a seed waiting to grow. The storm hit without warning. The early morning sky had been a muted gray, thick with clouds, but by midday, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows of the old farmhouse. Jason had been out in the field when the first fat raindrops began to fall, and before he knew it, the sky had opened up, releasing a torrent of rain that turned the ground into a muddy mess. "Get the animals inside," Sarah shouted over the roar of the wind as she ran past him, her hair whipped around by the storm. Jason sprinted after her, his feet sinking into the mud as the rain pelted down harder. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and the distant rumble of thunder. Inside the barn, the horses whinnied nervously, sensing the shift in the weather. Jason quickly set to work, helping Sarah secure the doors and make sure the animals were safe. His heart raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins as the wind battered the barn walls, rattling the loose boards and making everything feel precarious. "Are they all inside?" Jason asked breathlessly, wiping the rain from his face. Sarah nodded, her face tense. "We need to check the fences. If the storm knocks any of them down, the animals could get out." Without hesitation, the two of them raced back out into the storm, the rain stinging their skin as they ran toward the far edge of the field where the fence line stretched. Jason could barely see a few feet in front of him through the sheets of rain, but Sarah moved with purpose, leading the way. When they reached the fence, they could see that parts of it were already leaning dangerously, the wind threatening to tear it apart at any moment. "We need to reinforce it," Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Jason grabbed a hammer and some nails from the nearby shed, his hands shaking as he tried to secure the fence. The rain was relentless, soaking through his clothes and making every movement more difficult. Sarah was beside him, her hands working quickly and efficiently despite the conditions. They did not have time to talk, only to work. Every second felt like a race against the storm. Finally, after what felt like hours, they managed to secure the last section of the fence. Both of them stood there, panting, drenched to the bone, and utterly exhausted. The wind had not let up, but the fence held steady, and for now, the animals were safe. Jason looked over at Sarah, her face streaked with rain and mud, her hair plastered to her forehead. There was a fire in her eyes, a resilience he could not help but admire. She caught his gaze and gave him a brief nod, just a small acknowledgement of the work they had done, but it was enough. They had survived the worst of it, together. "Let's get back inside," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. "We are no good to the farm if we are both sick tomorrow." They made their way back to the farmhouse, the storm still raging outside. Inside, the warmth of the house felt almost surreal after the chaos of the storm. They stood in the entryway, dripping water onto the floor, both too tired to speak for a moment. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. "For helping." Jason, still catching his breath, shrugged. "I did not really have a choice, did I?" Sarah gave a small smile, one of the first he had seen since he arrived. It was not much, but it was enough to make something inside him shift again, that slow, creeping sense that maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to understand each other. "I will get a fire started," Jason said, surprising himself. He was not sure why he offered, but after weeks of working beside Sarah, he had picked up enough about how to survive here that it did not feel like an impossible task. As the fire crackled in the small living room, the storm continued to beat against the windows. Jason sat across from Sarah, the warmth from the fire slowly thawing his cold, aching limbs. For a while, either of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable for the first time. "It was like this when my father died," Sarah said suddenly, her voice soft, almost lost in the sound of the fire. Jason looked up, caught off guard by the shift in tone. "A storm, I mean. It tore through the farm, just like today. We lost half the crops that year." Jason was not sure how to respond. He had never really asked Sarah about her life before he came here. He had been too wrapped up in his own misery to care. But now, hearing her talk about her father, he realized how little he actually knew about the person sitting across from him. "How old were you?" he asked quietly. 23, Sarah replied, her eyes fixed on the flames. He had been sick for a while, but it still felt sudden. One minute he was here, and the next, everything was gone. "It was just me, trying to keep the farm going." Jason leaned back, processing her words. He had always thought of the farm as a burden, something his father had forced upon him. But for Sarah, it was her legacy, her responsibility. She had fought for this place alone, and had managed to keep it going through sheer will. "I did not realize," Jason admitted, his voice low. I did not think about what this place meant to you. I have been so focused on how much I hate being here that I never stopped to think about what it has been like for you." Sarah's gaze softened, her eyes meeting his. "I did not expect you to," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You were not sent here because you wanted to be, but that does not mean you cannot learn to care about it." They sat in silence again, the weight of her words sinking in. Jason was not sure what to say. He was not even sure what he felt. All he knew was that something had shifted between them, something small but significant. For the first time, he saw Sarah not just as the woman he had been forced to marry, but as someone who had survived her own battles, someone who had fought for her place in the world. And for the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he could fight for something too. The days following the storm were quieter, more reflective. The air still smelled of rain, the fields still soaked from the downpour, but the farm had survived, and so had Jason and Sarah. For Jason, something had changed during that storm. The backbreaking labor, the endless tasks, and the grueling days no longer felt like punishment, at least not in the way they had before. He was still exhausted by the end of every day, still unsure of where he fit in this strange new life. But there was a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, he could handle it. Then came the phone call from his father. It had been nearly 2 months since William had last spoken to him, since he had sent Jason off to Montana like a child being punished. Jason had expected a check-in much sooner, but his father had remained silent. Until now. Sarah was outside when Jason answered the phone, wiping his hands on his jeans as he glanced through the kitchen window. His father's voice was crisp and businesslike, as it always was, with none of the warmth one might expect from a father speaking to his son. "Jason," William said, not bothering with small talk. "How is life on the farm?" Jason hesitated, unsure how to respond. "It is fine," he replied cautiously. What is this about, Dad? There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that Jason had learned to dread. His father was calculating, always planning his next move, always one step ahead, and Jason knew that whatever was about to come next was not just a casual check-in. I have an offer for you, William said finally, his voice smooth. You have been out there long enough. I think it is time for you to come home. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He had been waiting for this, waiting for the moment when his father would call him back, offer him a way out. But now that it was here, something did not feel right. He glanced out the window again, watching as Sarah worked in the distance, her figure silhouetted against the setting sun. What kind of offer? Jason asked slowly, wary of where this conversation was headed. You have proven you can handle responsibility, William said. At least in the sense that you have not completely failed out there. I am willing to bring you back into the fold, back into the company. But there are conditions. Of course there were. There were always conditions with William Carter. Nothing came without strings attached. And what are those conditions? Jason asked, his jaw tightening. You will return to New York, take up a position at the company, and you will leave the farm. You will leave Sarah, William said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. This was always meant to be temporary, Jason. I did not expect you to stay out there forever. Now it is time to come home. Jason's stomach churned at the cold finality of his father's words. Leave the farm. Leave Sarah. It was so simple to William, so black and white. Jason could feel the weight of the offer settling on his shoulders, suffocating him. This was what he had wanted, was it not? To get out, to return to his old life, to escape the farm and everything it represented. But now, standing in the kitchen of that small farmhouse, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter, Jason was not so sure anymore. He had hated this place when he first arrived, hated the work, hated the isolation, hated everything about it. But over the last few weeks, something had shifted. The farm had become something more than just a punishment. It had become real. And Sarah? Sarah was not just the woman he had been forced to marry. She had become something else, someone else. He did not know exactly what she meant to him yet, but the thought of leaving her, of walking away from this life and going back to the cold, sterile world of New York, made his chest tighten with a sense of loss he had not expected. I do not know, Jason said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. William's voice hardened. This is not a request, Jason. I am giving you a way out. Do not be a fool. You do not belong out there. Come home and take your place where you belong. Jason stared out the window, his mind racing. This was his chance to get everything back. The money, the power, the life he had always known. But at what cost? Could he really walk away from the farm? From Sarah? From the strange, uncertain future that had started to take root here? I need to think about it, Jason said finally, his voice tight. William's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Do not take too long, he said coldly. You do not have forever. The line went dead, and Jason was left standing in the kitchen, the phone still in his hand, the weight of his father's ultimatum hanging over him like a storm cloud. The next morning, Jason woke up with a knot in his stomach. His father's offer loomed over him, casting a shadow on everything he did. He could not shake the feeling that this was some kind of test, another move in William's never-ending game of control. But this time, the stakes felt different. Jason went through the motions of the morning chores, but his mind was elsewhere. It was on Sarah, on the farm, on New York. On the life he had once wanted so desperately to return to, and the life he had unexpectedly found here. The two worlds felt so far apart, and yet, William was asking him to choose between them. He could not avoid the conversation any longer. After dinner, Jason found Sarah in the living room, reading by the light of the fire. She glanced up when he entered but did not say anything, waiting for him to speak. We need to talk, Jason said, his voice tight. Sarah closed her book and set it aside, her expression serious. What is going on? Jason took a deep breath, the words heavy on his tongue. My father called yesterday. He offered me a way out. Sarah did not react right away. She just stared at him, her face carefully blank. A way out? He wants me to come back to New York, to take a position at the company. But Jason hesitated, the weight of the next part making his chest ache. But if I go back, I have to leave the farm. Leave you? Sarah's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes, something Jason could not quite read. She stood up, walking over to the window and looking out into the night. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, thick and tense. So, what are you going to do? She asked quietly, still not looking at him. Jason ran a hand through his hair, feeling more lost than ever. I do not know. This is what I wanted, right? To go back, to leave all of this behind. Sarah turned to face him, her gaze steady but filled with a kind of sadness that cut through him. Is it? Is that really what you want? The question hung in the air, and for the first time, Jason did not have an immediate answer. He had spent so much of his life chasing after what he thought he wanted: money, status, power. But now, standing in this old farmhouse, surrounded by the quiet of the countryside, he was not sure anymore. I do not know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Everything I thought I wanted, it does not feel the same anymore. Not after being here. Not after meeting you. Sarah's eyes softened, and she took a step closer to him. Then maybe you have changed. Maybe this place, this life, maybe it has become something more than just a punishment. Jason looked at her, the firelight casting warm shadows across her face. She had always been strong, always been the one who held everything together. But now, he could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the unspoken question of whether he would stay or leave. And suddenly, the decision did not feel so impossible. He reached out, taking her hand in his. I do not want to leave, Sarah. I do not want to go back to New York and pretend like none of this ever happened. I do not want to pretend like you do not matter. Sarah blinked, her breath catching in her throat. Are you saying? I am saying I want to stay, Jason said, the words spilling out with a kind of certainty he had not felt in weeks. I want to stay here with you. For a moment, Sarah just stared at him as if she was not sure whether to believe him. Then, slowly, her lips curved into a small, tentative smile. You are sure? I am sure, Jason said, pulling her closer. I am more sure of this than I have ever been about anything. Sarah's smile grew, and for the first time, Jason saw a softness in her that she had kept hidden for so long. She wrapped her arms around him, and they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, the weight of the decision lifting off Jason's shoulders. The next morning, when William called again, Jason answered with a new sense of clarity. I have made my decision, Jason said firmly, his voice unwavering. Henry did not respond right away. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with expectation. And I am staying here, Jason said, the words coming easily now. I am not coming back to New York, not to the company, not to the life I had. I am staying on the farm. There was another long pause, and then William's voice turned cold. You are throwing everything away, Jason. For what? A farm? A woman you barely know. This is a mistake. Jason's jaw tightened, but his resolve did not waver. Maybe it is, but it is my mistake to make. William's silence was deafening, and for a moment, Jason thought his father might hang up. But then, William spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. If you walk away from this, you are on your own. No money, no support. You will be cut off for good. Jason took a deep breath, letting the reality of his father's words sink in. He had known this was coming, known that William would never let him go without a fight. But now, standing in the small farmhouse that had become his home, with Sarah by his side, the threat did not scare him anymore. That is fine, Jason said quietly. I do not need your money. For the first time in his life, Jason felt free. The conversation with his father left a heavy weight on Jason's chest. But as he hung up the phone, he felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. It was strange, cutting ties with the life he had known for so long. The luxury, the power, the sense of control. It was all gone. But in its place was something else, something more solid, more real. He walked out onto the porch, where the late afternoon sun bathed the fields in a soft, golden light. Sarah was in the distance, tending to the animals as usual, and Jason could not help but smile at the sight of her. Everything about this life, about her, felt right in a way he could not quite put into words. Just as he was about to join her, a familiar black car pulled up to the farmhouse, its sleek form so out of place in the rustic setting. Jason's stomach turned when he saw who stepped out of the car. William Carter, looking as sharp and intimidating as ever, walked toward the house with purpose. His suit was immaculate, not a hair out of place, as if the dirt roads and fields did not exist in his world. Jason had not seen his father in months, and the sudden appearance felt like a punch to the gut. Sarah noticed William from the distance, and stopped what she was doing, walking toward the house with a cautious expression. She could sense the tension even from afar. "What are you doing here?" Jason asked, stepping off the porch and meeting his father halfway. William's eyes were cold as he looked around, his gaze settling on the farmhouse, the fields, the animals. "I had to see for myself, to see what could possibly make my son turn his back on everything I have built." Jason clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I am not turning my back on anything. I am making my own life, something you have never let me do." William gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Your own life? Out here with this farm? You think this is some grand rebellion, Jason? But it is not. You are throwing everything away for what? A woman you do not even know. A life you are not built for?" Sarah stepped up beside Jason, her expression calm but wary. She met William's gaze, her chin held high, not backing down from his intimidating presence. Jason could not help but feel a surge of pride for her in that moment. "This is not a rebellion," Jason said, his voice steady. "It is me choosing something different. Something real." William's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "You think this is real? You do not even know the truth." Jason frowned, his heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" William glanced at Sarah, then back at Jason, his gaze icy. "The marriage, you think it was my idea? You think I was the one who arranged it?" Jason's stomach dropped, confusion and dread swirling in his gut. "What are you saying?" William crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Sarah came to me first. She needed the money to save this place. The farm was failing, and she was desperate. She proposed the marriage, said she would do whatever it took to keep this farm. I just happened to see an opportunity to teach you a lesson." The words hit Jason like a physical blow. He turned to Sarah, his heart racing. "Is that true?" Sarah's face paled, but she did not look away. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a sadness that Jason had not seen before. "It is true," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I did go to your father, but it was not because I wanted to manipulate you. It was because I did not have a choice. The farm was in trouble, and I could not let it go under. I did what I had to do to survive." Jason's chest tightened, anger and betrayal swirling in his mind. He felt blindsided, like the ground had just been ripped out from under him. All this time, he had believed that William had orchestrated everything, that he had been the one pulling the strings. But now, hearing that Sarah had been part of it, it changed everything. "You should have told me," Jason said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You should have been honest." Sarah's eyes filled with regret, but she did not back down. "I know. I should have. But I did not know how. I was scared you would leave, and the farm would be lost. I thought if we could just get through it, maybe things would change." William watched the exchange with a smug expression, clearly enjoying the chaos he had caused. "See, Jason? This was never about love or building a new life. It was about survival, just like everything else in this world." Jason turned back to his father, his anger bubbling to the surface. You do not get to walk in here and act like you are the hero in this. You pushed me into this life. You set all of this up, knowing how it would play out. You do not care about me. You never have. William's face hardened, the smugness gone. I was trying to save you from yourself, Jason. You have always been weak, always chasing after things that do not matter. This was supposed to be a lesson. Jason shook his head, stepping forward. I am not weak. Not anymore. You might have set this up, but I stayed because I wanted to. And now, I am choosing to stay. William's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp. You are making a mistake. Maybe, Jason replied, his voice firm. But it is mine to make. For a moment, the silence between them was deafening. William stood there, his jaw clenched, clearly furious that Jason was not backing down, but Jason did not care anymore. For the first time, he felt like he was in control of his own life. William finally turned and walked back to his car without another word. The sound of the engine revving to life filled the quiet, and within moments he was gone, leaving Jason and Sarah standing there in the fading light. Jason turned to Sarah, his chest still tight with emotion. Why did you not tell me? Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. Because I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you would leave, and I did not want you to go. Jason took a deep breath, the anger slowly melting away. He stepped forward, taking her hand. I am not leaving, Sarah. Not now. Not ever. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. Even after everything? Jason nodded, his voice soft but sure. Even after everything. The days after William's visit passed quietly, but the weight of his revelation still lingered between Jason and Sarah. The truth had come out, and it left scars that were not easy to ignore. Yet, despite the hurt, something stronger had begun to grow, a resolve to move forward together, no matter what. Jason had made his choice, and he was not going to back down from it. The farm, the life he was building with Sarah, had become something real to him, something that no amount of money or power in New York could replace. But more importantly, Sarah had become more than just the woman his father had forced him to marry. She was his partner, and he was not going to let the past destroy what they had. One evening, as the sun began to set over the fields, Jason found Sarah sitting on the porch, her hands resting in her lap as she gazed out over the land she had fought so hard to protect. He sat down beside her, the familiar creak of the porch boards settling beneath him. You have been quiet, Jason said gently, glancing at her. Sarah did not respond right away, but after a moment she sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I have been thinking. Jason waited, giving her the space she needed. He had learned over the past few months that Sarah was not one to rush her words. She was careful, deliberate, and when she spoke, it always carried weight. I have been thinking about us, she said finally, her voice soft but steady. About how we got here. Everything that has happened. I do not want to pretend like it did not hurt, Jason. The way this all started, the way I kept the truth from you, it was not fair to either of us. Jason nodded, his heart heavy with understanding. I know. But I also know why you did it. I get it now. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, regret, hope, and something else he could not quite name. I did not know if you would still want to stay after everything. Jason reached out, taking her hand in his. I am here because I want to be Sarah. Not because of my father or the deal you made. I am staying because I want this. I want us. She blinked, her lips trembling slightly as she fought back tears. It was rare to see Sarah so vulnerable, so open, but Jason knew that this was as real as it got. She had been carrying so much on her own for so long, and now she was letting him in. You do not know how much that means to me, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. Jason squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. I think I do. We have both been through a lot, and I will not pretend like it will be easy. But I am ready for whatever comes next. Sarah nodded, her eyes locking with his. So am I. For a long moment they just sat there, the silence between them comfortable and full of promise. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the fields. It was a quiet evening, the kind that made everything feel possible, even after all the pain and uncertainty they had faced. "I think this is the first time I have really felt like I belong here," Jason said after a while, his voice soft but filled with a sense of peace he had not known before. Sarah smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes. "I think you do. You have changed, Jason. You have found your place." He could not argue with that. The man he had been when he first arrived on the farm was long gone, replaced by someone who understood the value of hard work, of resilience, of love. The farm had tested him in ways he never expected, and it had given him more than he ever could have imagined. "I guess I have," he agreed, his heart full. "And I am not going anywhere." As the days turned into weeks, Jason and Sarah worked side by side to build their life together. The farm, once a symbol of his father's punishment, had become a place of growth, of new beginnings. They repaired fences, tended to the animals, and planned for the future with a sense of hope that had not been there before. One evening, as they stood by the barn watching the sunset, Jason turned to Sarah, his heart swelling with gratitude for the life they were building together. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "this is more than I ever thought I would have, more than I ever thought I would want." Sarah smiled softly, her hands slipping into his. "Me too." They stood there, watching the sun sink below the horizon, knowing that the challenges were not over, but also knowing that they were ready to face them together. The farm, their home, was no longer just a piece of land. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome, and everything they had yet to build. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, Jason knew with certainty that he had found something far more valuable than any amount of money or success in New York could ever offer. He had found purpose, love, and the life he had never known he needed. Together, they were ready for whatever came next.